Welcome. We're so happy that you have joined us for this semester's Coming to the Center program of Cherry Hill Seminary. If you don't know how you got here, be sure to visit cherryhillseminary.org later today and find out who we are. And I'm pleased to look around the room and see some of our esteemed guests. Today, I'm excited that we have got something special. And I only stumbled across the video of this band a little while ago, so I'll just put that aside for now. I want to introduce you to a scholar named Padraic Fitzgerald. We ran into each other in a symposium or a seminar of some kind through the College of Charleston, where he has just completed. Is that where you did your dissertation work, Padraic?
I did my PhD at the University of Denver, but now I work full time for College of Charleston.
Okay, so as you might guess, College of Charleston's not all that far from me, so I had to reach out to this person who clearly seemed to be pagan. And by the time we had visited for a while, I thought, oh, we really need to share you with our students and Cherry Hill family. So I am not going to tell you a whole lot more, but Padraic has recently graduated from the University of Denver and also the Iliff School of Theology with a joint doctoral program in religious studies. And his dissertation is called Valhalla, the Formation of Nordic Neopagan Identity, Religiosity, and Community at a Norwegian Heavy Metal Festival. I'm not heathen, and it's not really my music genre, but I have found this whole exploration absolutely fascinating. And I've got lots of questions for you today, Padraic. So without any more ado, I'm going to pass it off to you to talk to us.
All right. Well, thank you all for having me. It is a very high honor to be with you today on this lovely Saturday afternoon. So, as Holly was saying, I recently completed my PhD in religious studies in a joint program at the University of Denver and the Iliff School of Theology, and I focused on Nordic Neopaganism. So, I have, I don't know, I have a I feel like with many of us who self-identify as some form of neo-pagan, um, it was a long road. I was born into an Irish Catholic family, but I found out very fast that if you knew where to look, some of the old ways were preserved in that cultural context. Thanks and specific thanks should go out to my mom. She was very much in touch with our Irish and Northern European heritage, and she provided me all these lovely books on mythology that I voraciously consumed as I was growing up. And, getting into the Catholic high school environment, I naturally had an inclination to rebel. So I started looking into alternative religious movements. And I also found an enjoyment of heavy metal and punk rock and hardcore and all that fun stuff at the time. And I've just kind of held on to that. But I got to undergrad and I focused my studies on anthropology, but that was, I don't know. I stuck with that major. I enjoyed some of the courses, but I found I had most success in the religion and philosophy department. So I finished my undergrad with not a terribly high GPA, but it worked out. I told myself, after this, if I'm supposed to do graduate studies, I'll go the religious studies route. And things worked out and I did. And for quite some time, or for the majority of my education, I wanted to look deeper into neo-paganism because I thought it was providing a suitable path for people that were dissatisfied maybe with the religions of their birth, or maybe they were dissatisfied with, oh, how do I word this? I don't know, the religious status quo that, on the surface can seem very, very stagnant. And I was lucky enough to meet some scholar practitioners of Nordic neo-paganism from Scandinavia that have become dear friends of mine, and they helped point me in the right direction as far as my academic work is concerned. And through them, uh, I've learned a bit about some growth points within Nordic Neopaganism in particular that I'm looking forward to speaking with y'all a little bit about today. But that's the quick and dirty background on me. Holly, I'll pass it off to you. Do you have any specific questions you wanted to get us started with?
Yeah, so I think you answered one of those, which was how you picked this topic for your dissertation. It was clearly very personal. And I wanted to know if you might tell us more about I was really intrigued by the paper I read by you, where you talk about music as a medium and musical performance, transporting people to the past. And that's something that we kind of grapple with among all the pagan traditions, I believe. This kind of constant tug between we're here, but we're pulling on this thing from the past. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, and I apologize. I have to organize my thoughts a little bit because my natural inclination is to try to talk about a million things at once, and then we're not going to get anywhere. But I think just from my own recent work with some of these scholar practitioners, I think as pagans, a lot of us are drawn to, a lot of these rich bodies of folk traditions from, many parts of the world. But, with neo-paganism in particular, I'm going to go out on a limb and hazard a guess that a lot of us here that belong to a form of neo-paganism or Wicca, we're drawing from a lot of these European folk traditions that sort of fell to the wayside with the Christianization of the Mediterranean and mainland Europe. And what we have now, you know, um, it is what it is. But I feel like for a lot of pagan traditions, and I'll focus on just Nordic neo-paganism, um, a lot of what we have written down in the sagas and the Eddas, and we could also look at Celtic neo-paganism as well. A lot of the stuff was preserved by the clergy. But it's interesting because while it is preserved and we are looking at, we're looking backwards through this Christian lens, if these clergy really wanted to stamp it out, they wouldn't have written about it at all. And of course, you have the people in the rural communities that kept these folk traditions alive, which you see all over Europe. You have Beltane in the Celtic countries, or you have Midsommar in Scandinavia, things like that. But even though we have this sort of incomplete picture, not just from, the writings, but also the preserved folk traditions too, because naturally, as we move through time, meaning is sometimes lost, but new meaning is applied. There's a really great scholar whose work I really admire. And I'll type him in the chat. And he's kind of attached to this new Nordic neo-pagan religious movement, which I'll chat about a little later. Just this guy by the name of Rune Jarno Rasmussen. He's a Danish historian of religion. He is initiated into candomblé. He did his research in Brazil, and he does a lot of cross-cultural dialogue with indigenous academics. And he's really championing this this movement called Nordic animism. And he's arguing, I mean, with his own work, he looks to the Northern European, not just Scandinavian, but Northern European archaeological record and historical record. And he's working with a lot of these modern indigenous academics. And he's come to the conclusion that, a lot of these old folk traditions and these folk cultures, they were animist in nature. And, animist is kind of a dirty word, or it can be, but there are many scholars like Rune who are trying to say, hey, animism, it's really a word for technologies for building relation between communities and the natural environment and the other than human personalities that live in that environment. So not just animals and trees and mountains and rivers, but spirits and gods and goddesses as well. And in his work, he actually just put out a video talking about how, religion as a phenomenon. There never really has been a pure mode of religion because human beings were a social species and we interact with one another. And globalization, whether it's through trade or warfare, that's been going on for as long as we've been a species. So you have a lot of these religious, um, I think mutation's kind of a harsh word, but you have these outgrowths happening all the time. And with paganism in particular, we're working with, we're looking to the past to construct something for the present that can move us into the future. And of course, there's not going to be a pure meaning that's preserved, but in that effort to construct, our individual religious identities, but also communal religious identities, meaning we will ascribe meaning to this phenomenon as is needed. Does that make sense? I'm also sorry. I saw somebody posted a question in the chat, and as I was going through that, I was like, "Oh, I want to answer that," but I also, I'm kind of like a dog chasing cars sometimes.
I'll come back to it.
But I think, to bring music into it, I think music is a really great medium for people to get in touch with a lot of these folk cultural pasts. And one I suppose one viewpoint I have for neo-pagan traditions is that they are modern folk religions, or rather, they are vernacular folk religions. So at the same time, while there's different cultural iterations of paganism, at the end of the day, while there may be communities of practitioners at the individual level, everybody's going to practice in their own different way. Now, sure, there's going to be communal rituals. So in Nordic Neopaganism, for instance, there's the blot, which some of you may be familiar with, and I have a little travel diary I'm going to share with you later of my trip to this metal festival. I have a picture of one of the blots performed there. But yeah, there are communal rituals, but I think a lot of how this religion grows, or these religions grow, is at the individual level, and the meaning individuals bring to those religious traditions that can then be informed through listening to various types of music. So, in the 90s, for example, I think Celtic paganism had and I mean, it's still growing. All of these traditions are still growing because more and more people are drawn to them. But, if we look at the late 80s and the 90s, with Celtic paganism and Wicca growing in prominence, for example, you have some people listening to Enya or Celtic Woman to try to, better, maybe on the surface, better understand the cultural traditions and past of the Celtic world to better inform their own beliefs. But when they do that, folk music is a really powerful thing because you have all these ephemeral symbolisms that's baked into it, and there's different facets of it because there is the melodic tradition, there's specific musicologies of the Celtic world, there's specific rhythms of the Celtic world, such as the bowrin, the hand drum. I've got some hanging on my wall back here, but there are specific musicologies that contain a lot of these really powerful symbols and meanings that are inherent to these cultures that when people listen to, especially if they really jive with that music, maybe the hair on the back of their neck stands up, or maybe they get the shivers or something, they're embodying those symbols that are being conveyed through sound. Does that make sense? Because I think that's what makes music so powerful for paganisms. Because yes, even though we're working with, maybe we're looking into the past through like a secular or a culturally Christian lens, particularly in the West. But even so, a lot of those preserved folk musicologies they literally help people feel that folk past. And Heilung, as Holly was playing, they are definitely one of these bands that in the Nordic neo-pagan sphere, people are engaging with. They like to listen to it, but they're also engaging with it ritually in their own personal practices too. So I think music as a general phenomenon for paganism is going to be a really important religious tool moving forward, because I think it's not only drawing people to these traditions, but it's, in a way, it's helping people embody these, these sound or these symbols that are conveyed through the music. They can feel it and they can be drawn to what some scholars label an imagined elsewhere. Owen Coggins is the scholar I'm referencing. He did a lot of stuff with drone metal, which is a whole nother thing. But in his work, he talks about music, transporting people if they're practicing like active listening and receptive to it. People are transported to this, an imagined place. But when I say imagined, I don't mean, oh, that's nonsense. It's not. Imagination is incredibly powerful.
Mhm.
And when people are transported there, they get meaning from that realm. And, music, according to some scholars, that's a portal to the other world in some ways. Um,
Patrick,
yeah.
I want you to tell the story of going over there to Midgard's float, but it occurs to me, I wish I had seen this video sooner. And I'm thinking that even if I can't get the sound quite right, it might be helpful. The picture's worth 1,000 words thing. Would you
Oh,
like me to
absolutely.
try to share that again? And guys, thank you for your patience with me. Um, one of these days I'll hire a Zoom tech for when I do these things. I didn't realize what rich stuff we had. Okay, so.
I can I can share my screen and pull this up. I see
Oh,
some.
okay. Yeah, great. Because it wasn't doing commercials when I watched it before. Now it's poking commercials at
Oh,
me.
well, I mean, I can pull up a clip and share it with sound of Heilung, but I also have a little PowerPoint put together of like, some of the pictures I took there and, some of the things going on that make
Okay.
this place like
Yeah.
sacred. So I also see a bunch of great questions in the chat. I cannot wait to address those. So thank you
Good.
all for posting your thoughts.
Thank you, Dave.
Um,
I see that.
so a little bit of background, if okay. All right. So a little bit of background on this festival. So Midgårdsblot, um, the name itself references a ritual, a blot. And the name, when translated literally, is a ritual for Earth or the realm of humanity. And this festival started out in 2015, and it has since grown. I didn't always realize I wanted to incorporate this festival into my dissertation, but I kind of had an aha moment after my first couple years of coursework when I realized, like, oh wow, I can get funding to go do this. So, selfishly as a metalhead and, and a neo-pagan, I'm like, oh yeah, this is gonna be great. I can get the school to pay for it, but it did pay, dividends. I did met a lot of really great people and had a lot of really wonderful experiences. So I have a couple better pictures, but here I've got the festival lineup, and it's kind of a lot of these bands I'm sure might be unfamiliar to many of you, but some of them are kind of like a telltale sign of what this festival is about. So these bands, Vadruna, Heilung, also one down here, Mörkur, among others, they are vocally Nordic Neopagan. And they're interesting because they also represent authority figures within this tradition. So, for those of you familiar with heathenry or Nordic neo-paganism, you may recognize the titles Gothi or Githya, which would be priest or priestess. So, the leaders of local communities that will lead rituals. But what's interesting about bands such as Vadruna and Heilung, one, they actively label their performances as rituals, but they're also vocal Nordic neo-pagans, and they share their personal ritual practices and their ritualized creative processes with their followers on social media. So Heilung, for instance, you may have noticed, even though we couldn't hear the sound, you may have noticed the really ornate costumes. Heilung, they try to they try to embody the Nordic Iron Age, and they ritually craft all their instruments. Their drums, they have a friend who is a nurse, so they weren't just doing this in an unsupervised setting, but they had a friend of theirs draw their blood so they could anoint their instruments with it. And they have a giant drum they tour with that is still, it's got this orange hue to it because that's one of the instruments they crafted in this way. Vadruna is also very similar. Their lead singer Einar Selvik, he's fascinating. I mean, he self-identifies as Nordic Neopagan, and he kind of lives this tradition through his art. I mean, he personally crafts the instruments he uses. He carves, uh, he has some horns made out of ox horn that he uses in a lot of songs, but he also ritually records. Now, Vadruna are interesting because their first few albums, each song is dedicated to a runic letter or a letter of the runic alphabet. And these letters have poems attached to them, which, they can get a little metaphysical in nature. And well, for example, there was a song for the rune Isa, which is equated with ice. And Vadruna worked with the Norwegian National Park Service to have access to some glacial ice cores from one of the glaciers in the national parks in the middle of the country. And they performed the percussion for this song with those ice cores. So it's this really interesting, like, creative process that they have. Einar also talks about depending on the song, of course, he will go, meditate in the forest and just play. He has a traditional skaldic harp that, he'll go play around with and try to get the creative juices flowing, so to speak. But they also will perform blots when they are doing this composition. So that was a very roundabout way of me pointing to the fact that this festival actively incorporates Nordic neo-pagan artists and performers, but they also mobilize a lot of Nordic folk symbolism. Because another interesting thing about this festival is that it takes place in a national park called Borehaugen, or the place of the Bore Mounds. So there are Iron Age burial mounds on this site. In fact, this gate here that says Valhalla, this gate is maybe about 100 meters from the burial mounds, and they're coastal too. So there's like some coastal woodlands, and these burial mounds are like dotting the landscape here. They're very big. I have a picture of one. It kind of just looks like a hill, but they are very large. So even when you're walking into this festival, it is. I saw in one of the posts, someone made a statement about liminal spaces. So when you're walking into this festival, if you're receptive to it, it really is this liminal area. But just the mounds being there, and the incorporation of a lot of this Nordic folk symbolism, that's only part of it, because this festival is also co-hosted by the museum that's on this site that houses all of these artifacts from the mounds. So these touchstones to these non-familial ancestors that are still in the earth. But then on top of that, this museum, in addition to housing these artifacts, it's a temple in a different way, because they host a lecture series every year that, they bring in speakers that give talks on how to perform Nordic neo-pagan ritual in the modern day. There's discussions on, modern cosmology and worldview, and all these really fascinating things. But yeah, it's really, sorry. I'm a little overwhelmed kind of talking about it, because there's just so much happening at this place. But we can move forward here, and we can talk a little bit about ritual. So this picture here, and I have a better picture of the building in the background, but on the festival grounds for most of the year, it's a living history site managed by the museum I mentioned, and they have a reconstructed Viking Age long hall there, which is the building in the background. And in the long hall, they have a little bit more intimate performances and talks and things like that. But this ritual we see here, this blot, this is the opening ceremony. And it is overseen by a musical and Nordic Neopagan ritual group called Folket Bortafor Nordavinden, or the people beyond the north wind. And they're a little hard to see, but they're in the circle here. They're playing the drums and they're chanting. But what happened is they set up this demarcated ritual space, and you can see these two statues in the center. One statue is of the god Odin, and another is of the goddess Freya, or Freya, as she's often called. And these statues were anointed with blood. But spoiler alert, it was theatrical blood, but I don't think that really detracted from it. But these statues were anointed with this blood, and people, the band, or the group, I should say, they were taking these bundles of sprigs and sprinkling this blood on people around the circle. And then they invited people into the circle. You can't see it because it's behind one of these people's heads, but there's an offering bowl on the ground of this quote unquote blood that people could dip their hands in and place their hand on one of the statues and then smear some blood on their face or arms. And a lot of people participated. I've got some pie charts and some boring data I gathered from this through a survey, but a lot of people participated in this. And for the next 4 days, people kept the blood on them, like on their faces and wherever else. And people were really, really proud of this ceremony. And another interesting facet is, in the midst of this ceremony, or rather towards the end of it, when things were starting to wind down and the musical performances were about to start, the lead singer here, this gentleman wearing the red tunic, he announced to the crowd that this was the largest blot to happen in Norway in 1,000 years. Which, if you weren't someone receptive to Nordic neopaganism or neopaganism in general or folk traditions, that's like, okay, that's a cool historical fact. But that really resonated with people. And that little quip of his was repeated in the lectures that were hosted at the museum. And as part of one of my papers, or part of a recent paper I gave at a conference that was held at College of Charleston a couple of weeks ago, I put together this piece pretty much just saying, it was pretty much a summary of my dissertation, which was saying, hey, this festival, Midgardsblot, this represents a sacred site for people self-identifying as Nordic neopagans, because people are experiencing ritual and they're learning how to grow their religious identity through these talks, but also interacting with other people. Because another great thing about Midgardsblot, people are wearing traditional garb throughout the festival. And some people, in some of the survey questions I posed, some people answered, it said, hey, when I wear this stuff, or when I wear, like, it's hard to see, but this is a Thor hammer pendant. When I wear, like, Nordic neopagan jewelry, this helps me flesh out who I am as a neopagan. So the short version of that paper was, this is a sacred space, but it's validated not only through the landscape, because those burial mounds are there, but it's validated by the rituals going on and the discourse that's happening pertaining to Nordic neopaganism, which is largely present in this lecture series called Mimir Talks. So a little bit of background. Mimir is a figure in Nordic mythology. He was once whole, but the god Odin cut his head off, but preserved it and spoke spells over it. So the head came back to life and gave Odin wise counsel. And Mimir is understood in the mythology to be one of the wisest beings next to the raven god Odin himself. And in this lecture series, it's very multifaceted. There is a lot focusing on modern Nordic neopagan practice. There was one lecture given by an academic from the University of Stavanger in Norway. Her name was Jana Schodel, and she gave a talk about how people are using uh, popular culture, such as video games, to kind of flesh out their Nordic Neopagan identity. She disseminated a survey and she found that, people are using games like World of Warcraft, Skyrim, The Witcher, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, to name a few. I mean, they're they're engaging with this media to, in a way, I talked about imagined elsewheres earlier. Like they're using this media, these, I mean, I think you could call some video games art, but they're using this modern pop art to sort of construct this imagined elsewhere. It's idealized for sure, but it is, people are using their imagination to construct this very modern worldview inspired by these very old traditions and symbols. But I digress. So, this lecture series, I want to share with you a couple of the talks I was able to witness there. So, one of them, if you squint and look at the projector up here in the middle, you see this gentleman named Tim Nancaro, and his talk is called Propitiation, Supplication, and Sacrifice. So Tim Nancaro is a current PhD candidate from Australia, and he's also a scholar practitioner. And he collaborated with the Midgard Viking Center, the museum, who co-hosted the festival. He collaborated with the museum personnel and the festival personnel to host a ritual to Odin. But there was another group he cooperated with. In Norwegian, they're called Smertakirken, but that translates to Church of Pain. And they're a group that engages in, ritual hook suspension. And Tim Nancaro, the day of his planned ritual, he gave this talk. And he talked a bit about the mythological background of Odin, but he talked about modern Nordic Neopagan ritual practice. And he argued, or he didn't argue, he wasn't arguing with people, but he was saying that, for this growing tradition, yes, it's important to look to the past and take inspiration from it and look to the myth and take inspiration from it. But just as much as we take inspiration from that, we need to, mobilize ritual as we can. I mean, he even argued that, when you're doing blot, you can even offer water as a gift of the earth back to the earth. And it still has just as much meaning as if you use mead or a blood sacrifice. But he then talked about the importance of commemoration in rituals. And then he shared a bit of his planned ritual for that evening. He was going to ritually suspend himself as a commemoration of Odin hanging himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain, in part, sorceress knowledge for himself, but to gain knowledge of the runes for humankind. And he talked about how, I'm choosing to do this. I've done my own meditations. I've had my own spiritual experiences with this deity. And I've had my own experiences with suspension. And I think this is going to be my way of honoring this god. But then he went on to say that his suspension would be done fully fasted to heighten his endorphin response, to put him in that heightened state of awareness. But he also said that there would be a local Nordic Neopagan group that would be chanting Galder, or ritual incantations, while he was doing this suspension. And unfortunately, well, even if I could have gotten in, I wouldn't have taken pictures. I feel like that might be a bit disrespectful, but I couldn't even get in if I tried, because it was held in this long hall, but the line was out the door. I couldn't even make it in after it started, but a lot of people were going to experience that ritual and to try to, be seen by the Raven God. So there are these ritual activities happening that aren't just official. So I talked about the opening blot and this suspension ceremony, and there was a closing blot too, hosted by the band Heilung, but it was tied into their musical performance. But there were a lot of personal rituals too. So I opted to camp on site at this festival. And the campsite is quite literally just a stone's throw from these burial mounds. And I recognized a couple familiar faces as I was walking back to camp at night. I noticed some people that were at these talks. I noticed they were going up to the mounds to perform their own rituals. I could see the flames of their candles floating like little willow wisps in the night air, and I could hear their drumming and chanting. So this festival is also a place of ritual experimentation for people self-identifying with, some type of not just Nordic neo-paganism, but neo-paganism in general. So yeah, there's just so much rich there's so many rich things happening at such an unassuming place. Because on the surface, like, oh, it's a metal festival and it's a bunch of heshers headbanging. But there's so much interpersonal dialogue with just on the ground Nordic neopagans, but they're also speaking with these emergent uh, emergent figures of Nordic neopaganism. And I also just realized I didn't even get to the other two lectures I wanted to share with you. So I know we're operating under a time limit, so I'll try to keep this short. But another special thing about this festival and about this lecture series in particular is some of the musicians that I was mentioning, such as Einar Selvik of Vadruna, they gave talks as part of this lecture series. And Einar gave a really wonderful talk about using music in a personal ritual setting, but also communal setting. But he also shared how his personal composition and performing practice, that was how he lived his Nordic neopaganism, because he's learned in a lot of these Norwegian folk musicologies. And he talks about how certain forms of singing, like the galder I mentioned earlier, certain forms of singing and other forms of music, they are aimed at the other than human spirits, the other than human personalities in the natural environment. He mentioned a form of singing called lok. Now I'm not gonna attempt to perform it for you, but you may have heard it before, but it's this very haunting, like lilting kind of. It's not yodeling, but it's somewhat similar to that. It's often performed by women, but in a Norwegian context, women were the ones that were herders. They were shepherds. And this lok was how they would not only communicate across valleys just to let one another know where they were, but it was also said that this form of singing attracted the benevolent vetir or spirits to you. And Einar said, well, we try to incorporate this in Vadruna's music, which is also why we try to encourage people, if it's meaningful to you, listen to it before or during a ritual setting that you're engaging. But following Einar, that academic Rune Rasmussen I posted in the chat, he gave a talk on Nordic animism, and he is one of these emergent authority figures that, I mean, he basically just came out and said it. He said Midgårdsblot was a Nordic animist gathering because it was a facilitation of community, and it was how people could, experiment with their religious identity and do ritual with one another, like at the tops of the grave mounds at night, or just participating in the festival itself could be considered a type of ritual. Just engaging with, the reenactors, participating in the reenactment processes, because the museum hosted all these awesome things. There was like a spear throwing workshop, there was a crafting workshop, there's all this stuff and all these different avenues for people to engage their Nordic neo-paganism with. So really, I think this festival and others like it are they're going to become more prominent, because they're not only spaces for, experimentation with religious identity, but they're also spaces where these emergent neo-pagan authority figures are, they're present and they're engaging with the community. But I also need to state that these authority figures, people on the ground, they're not necessarily going to call them that, but they are engaging with them and they're taking their ideas to experiment with their own religious identity. And Midgårdsblot is one of the places that this is happening. Sorry.
Patrick,
Yeah, sorry.
it struck me that Heilung is unapologetically shamanistic.
Hmm.
It's clear that they're making themselves a medium and conducting that kind of a ritual. And I loved, you might want to just share the little bit about from your paper about the Siberian shamans.
Oh yeah.
I thought that
So
was really neat.
Heilung. So I think just to preface what I'm about to say, um, and it's not just Nordic neo-paganism. I think a lot of neo-pagan traditions, um, you know, there are some problematic elements to it because some people are drawn to these traditions from, some people see neo-paganisms as white religion for white people. And there's some problematic elements within these traditions that are very vocal, but at Midgard's Blood in particular, it was a very inclusive environment. I think the majority of these groups that I've interacted with are very inclusive, but Heilung, on a broader level, they really embody this inclusivity. So, as Holly mentioned, they come across as shamanistic, but they are. And of course, the term shaman that deserves some nuancing because it initially refers to the Tungus people of Siberia and a figure that was part of those communities, the Saman, but it has come to be applied to many other indigenous traditions and contemporary traditions. But shaman is like the word religion. It may not be the best, but it serves its purpose. But the lead singer of Hilo, his name's Kai Uwe Faust. And you may have seen him a bit in the video. He had a horned hood headdress, but he and the band at large, they also, I mentioned Rune having a lot of cross-cultural dialogue and interfaith dialogue with a lot of indigenous academics, but Heilung do that as well. And they actually, it's pretty cool to see. I was able to go to one of their rituals in Colorado at the Red Rocks Amphitheater, and every time they tour North America, and South America too, they reach out to local indigenous communities and they invite them to perform with them. So Heilung, they always incorporate an opening and a closing ritual. And at Red Rocks, they invited people from the Ute Nation, the Arapaho Nation, and I mean, I say people, but these were medicine specialists. And they were dressed in their traditional garb and they brought their own drums and they were performing with Heilung, and Heilung, drew attention to the fact that, hey, we and a lot of people like us are in dialogue with these medicine specialists from these indigenous groups. And, you know, we don't want to put them on a pedestal in the sense that like, oh, we're shaman, but they have offered to teach us some things about their medicine tradition that we have incorporated into our own practice. And, we are also trying to give them a space to not only be seen, but to engage in dialogue too. And it's not just in North America. There is an article from The Guardian in the UK talking about Heilung and Vadruna, but the bit they have on Heilung, they interviewed a couple of the band members and they talked about a recent show they did. I believe it was in Russia, and they sent an invitation out to a lot of the indigenous groups from Siberia, so the Tungus, the Guldi, among others. And actual shaman showed up and got on stage with them and performed. So it's uh, I don't know. It's just another way in which this tradition is developing, which I think is really interesting because it's this meeting of, just music and ritual and, having input from medicine specialists from a lot of indigenous cultures. And there's this dialogue of sharing going on that I think is serving to further develop not just, this religion, because again, there are a lot of people that weren't Nordic neo-pagan that were at Midgard's Well, but they were Wiccan or another folk iteration of Neopagan, that we're getting meaning out of this. So
Is there any place you could go to something like this in North America?
there is, yes. So there's a handful, and I think, and I'll post these in the chat, and then sorry, lost my train of thought for a second. There is one I'm familiar with called, oh, that would have been a direct message to you, Holly. There's one called Cascadian Midsummer, which is a bit of a bear to get to, but there are smaller gatherings in the works that should be popping up on the East Coast. I do know a colleague of mine who I recently co-wrote the paper on Hylum with. His name is, and I'll type his name out too, but his name is Matthias Nordvig. And he is going to be in Alabama at a meadery there. I think it's called Ravenswood Meadery, but he's doing a drum workshop with one of the drummers from Heilung, and a lot of the Neopagans from the local community will be there. But it's, you know, it's not a contentious subject, but you know, one thing I realized just going to Midgardsblot, a lot of these festivals, yes, they are places for Neopagans to gather, but some of these festivals they're hard to get to, especially in today's economy. And you know, a lot of people, especially who I talked to at Midgardsblot, I mean, that was their big event of the year. They had saved for months to go and experience this. Also, sorry, I did just see Diana Paxson sharing some really awesome gatherings in the chat. So definitely check those out. I do recognize a couple of names on there as well. That also, seeing some of the different denominations in that post. When I was doing my survey at Midgardsblot, a lot of people self-identified as just general like Asatruar or Nordic Neopagan. There were a handful that identified as heathen, but they didn't really share the local troughs or kindreds they belonged to, which I thought was, you know, in retrospect, I feel like that's kind of interesting. It's almost as if those little, I guess, the community bonds don't disappear, but people are going to this festival and they're like, okay, this is a bigger Nordic Neopagan thing rather than just like Bifrost or Trothmut or Asatruar Folk Assembly, stuff like that. But yeah, there are, as Diana shared in the post, and there are many events similar to Midgardsblot and Cascadian Midsummer, but Midgardsblot and Cascadian Midsummer do have that musical element too. Not saying that people aren't performing music at these gatherings or listening to, you know, Vadruna and Heilung, because they certainly are. But
what was the significance of Heilung blowing those horns at the beginning?
So those types of horns, and Vadruna does this too. If they're the ones I'm thinking of, they're the big curved ones. Those are called lures. And lures were, and I learned this from Einar Selvik, lures made of bronze. So they're very expensive. Especially at the time, they were very expensive to make. They were largely used exclusively for ritual practice. So that is like an incorporation of a musical ritual technology into one of their songs. But again, like Heilung, I mean, they self-identify as Nordic Neopagan, but again, they are very vocal about their performances being rituals, and they engage in this ritualized creative process. And even they have one song called Alfadir Haiti, which means names of the Allfather or Odin. And the breakdown of the song it's really awesome, but they're just reciting, you know, you could compare, I mean, it's not too out of pocket, but you could kind of compare it to the Sufi practice of dhikr, reciting the names of Allah. Of course, it's different religious and cultural context, but again, you know, in a Nordic ritual context, reciting the names of this god, names have power. That's kind of a sacred thing, and they're putting it to this very heavy rhythmic drum beat. And when human beings experience that, our hearts synchronize to it. Our cortical rhythm synchronizes to a very powerful beat if we're exposed to it long enough. And a lot of Heilung songs do incorporate a very strong beat like that. So again, coming full circle, sort of. I mean, their music is designed, or yeah, it's consciously designed as ritual performance, but to be used in ritual as well, I think.
Is your dissertation available?
Yes, I am happy to share it. I have it's somewhere in my very messy desktop, but Holly, I can send it to you, and you can send it out at your leisure to those interested.
Okay.
I can also share my email address too if anyone wants to reach out.
And Cynthia has a good question. How was all of this received by your thesis committee?
They loved it. Okay, sorry. I'm very bad at multitasking. It was very well received. Although I consciously constructed my committee, uh, I I tried to get individuals that would let me, be myself. And my chair, this really lovely guy, his name's Trace Riddell, and he does a lot. He's a performance artist, and he does a lot with sound theory. And he talks about how sound can be used as a ritual technology to induce these, imagined elsewheres, but also altered states of consciousness, and how music can be used as a tool to bring about revelation. Not necessarily revelation in the Abrahamic sense, but
Personal,
yeah,
personal revelation. Yeah.
personal.
Who else has questions?
I was hoping you might tell us again about the gathering in Alabama. You said it so quickly and I got so excited. I'm here in Auburn, which is South Central Alabama. So if you could tell me a little bit more about it, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let me pull it up on my phone here, because I just saw the flyer for it the other day. Oh, where is this? I'm scrolling through my colleagues' social media to try to find this.
And Bob
My,
Patrick is saying something is in Huntsville. Is that it?
it's in Huntsville, but there's a
Yeah.
name. The event has a name.
Ravenwood is what Bob says.
Yes, Ravenwood's website should have the event on there. I think it is next weekend, if I remember correctly.
Huntsville is way up in the northeast corner. Oh, Carroll
Yeah.
Creek is there.
North Central.
Okay.
But yeah, one of the drummers from Heilung will be there. It'll be a drum building workshop. I don't remember what the ticket prices are, but there will also be a folklore publishing company. I see a folklore collective there called Hildir, which they publish a lot of literature. Like, they've published contemporary translations of the saga and the Eddas, but also rune poems, the tale of Sigurd, a lot of really great stuff like that.
Something I've observed with this interaction today and some of the other material you've shared with me is that we're very wordy in American, and I guess Brit too, ritual. Contemporary pagan ritual tends to be very scripted and a lot of words. And I know for 20 years I've been trying to make sure that my group breaks out of that as much as possible and tries to have some other sensory effects, but it's not easy. And these that you've shared strike me as really carrying you to that liminal edge and taking you over, with mostly the music and the performers themselves as the medium for the spiritual experience. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, There was, and I also I want to tie that question into because I'm scrolling back through the chat to try to get to all the questions I haven't gotten to address yet. But Robert, I really like your question. So after my little spiel, I want to give you the floor to talk a little bit more about nonlinearity. Um, but yeah, I mean I had my own experiences there. They weren't as I don't know, they weren't necessarily as profound as some of the others I have been able to have, but they were, well, actually, no, that's wrong. They were profound in more of a community way. Because, like, you know, maybe, I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar with Barbara Davy. She was one of those initial scholars to really produce a lot of stuff on general neo-paganism. And she talks about how, you know, a lot of us are solitaries. You know, we find these things that vibrate with us and energize us, and we kind of pursue it in our own ways. We do our own homework. But these festivals, and I mean, I in my time in Colorado, I was invited to participate in a local Nordic Neopagan gathering, which I was very nice. It was very cool to be a part of that community, but it it really was something to kind of be at this festival because it was also like the old Nordic thing or the all thing, which was a gathering once a year where people would perform ritual, but people would also just catch up with each other and hang out, and there'd be legal proceedings. There'd be executions as well, but you know, it was it was a big gathering where a lot of people from the countryside would come together, and it was just really interesting to experience Midgardsblot in that light because it kind of is like a modern all thing. You do have people coming from all over the world, and some people are spending a lot of money to be able to do this and have it be their big event of their year. And I think it just, you know, to borrow Roberts and James's language a little bit, it really is a liminal space. You are crossing into, you know, temporarily this. You're kind of simultaneously engaging with modern neo-paganism, but also kind of going back in time a little bit, being separated from the profane for a bit. So yeah, I think I did experience a lot of that
How do you think it
community
changed you?
community feel.
How did it change you?
I think I don't know. I think it made me a bit more, I guess, receptive because you know being a solitary for such a long time. And I mean, I in Colorado, I've got a bunch of great friends that I would go to Blot with once in a while. It wasn't an everyday thing, but well, actually, no, maybe not being receptive. That's not the right word. I really think it made me feel because I don't know. I'm also kind of just a solitary person to begin with. You know, I'm very yeah, I'm the product of working class Irish people. So it's like, you know, do it yourself. No one's going to help you, which isn't true. And I think, you know what? I lied. I did become more receptive to community because we aren't in this alone. We aren't by ourselves. And I feel like in various forms of Nordic neo-paganism, it's very, or in neo-paganism in general, it's like it is, you know, it starts from a personal interest, but being able to experience an event like this with other like-minded people, you know, not just metalheads, but, you know, people who are also into this folk culture and get meaning from it and see it as a way to, you know, define yourself as a person, but also to try to facilitate, you know, experience of the other in the natural world, facilitate a deeper respect for the natural world to maybe start healing uh, themselves and the natural world. I did that struck me a lot. It stuck with me. So yeah, I feel like I would just keep rambling if I attempted to define it any further. But you know, that's there's the scholar William James who's like, okay, you know, one of the things that defines a religious or mystic experience is you have a hard time talking about it. So, or this experience wasn't ineffable, but it's, you know, it's meaningful. And I'm the type of person where I don't know, it's very easy for me to kind of brush those things off. So going to Midgardsblot with, and I was with two very dear friends of mine that are also neo-pagans. Well, multiple dear friends, because my colleagues Matthias and Rune were there too. But like being able to just be there and, you know, talk about cosmology and philosophy in this natural and cultural setting, it was at the time, and I feel like this is the case for so many things, you know, at the time, I took it for granted. But looking back, it's like, wow, that really was a formative experience and powerful. And I really did get to meet so many lovely people that I hope to see again. But it also impacted my own worldview. Like after going to Midgardsblot, I've tried to, you know, I've tried to engage in my own type of animism. And, you know, I've recently relocated from Denver down to Florida, and I was very concerned because I would see two ravens frequently. They weren't necessarily the same ones, but I would see two ravens a lot. And in my own practice, I think, you know, Odin is a very multifaceted deity, but I often relate to this god under the name Hrafnagud, or Raven God. Because yeah, his other aspects can be very violent and very shifty, and dangerous. But I think as Hrafnagud, Odin is more similar to like Gandalf. He's, you know, the kindly old wanderer who also, you know, don't mess with him, but you know, he's a good person, good being. But I started to see like pairs of ravens all the time, and sometimes three ravens too. So I also, in my own kind of animism, I also, you know, my recent project, I want to get more in touch with my Gaelic ancestry. And I want to, you know, learn more about Baith and Morrigan, because I was interested in them for quite some time, and I still am. But I want to try to incorporate them into my personal practice. But I would see ravens all the time. And moving down to Florida, I was very scared. It's like, what if I stop seeing them? What if I stop having these experiences? And I got down here, and I was chatting with some of my friends still back in Colorado, and you know, chatting with you know, my partner down here too. She's not a neo-pagan. She's very, very supportive and very receptive. And she also has a love of the natural world as well. And I was talking with all of these people, and they said, no, it's not necessarily bound to place. It's going to follow you. So since I've been down here, you know, trying to notice those small omens, seeing the animals. I see crows all the time. I'm able to see, you know, sea creatures off, you know, off the seawall in the nearby park and stuff like that. So I think that festival has tried to make me, or it hasn't tried. I have tried to be more open to those small signs in the natural environments and trying to be in tune with them, to have that relationship of, you know, reciprocity, but also acknowledgement. And I've still been able to maintain that. Now, I haven't, you know, done a blot or anything since I've been down here, but you know, I've made like small offerings here and there, and I want to put together a little I guess shrine cabinet or shelf where I can put some statues on and some other things. But yeah, I honestly, yeah, I think I haven't given Midgardsblot and the people I've met there enough credit, because my own practice has changed since going. And I do look very much forward to going again one day.
You know, a lot of the modern scholars of paganism have commented on this festival culture and how important it's been, at least in America, to everything you just described. Most of us are more familiar with the ones that are a little more Wiccan based or generic or whatever. I do think that it's about time to start drawing this to a close, but I just want to ask if anybody else has something they'd like to share or ask.
Could I throw in one more thing? And I'm totally sorry. Robert, could you elaborate a bit more on nonlinearity?
Huh.
Yeah, actually, what I had in mind is just really simple. And by the time I got my question typed, you were already giving examples of it. But what I had in mind is that in liminal spaces and in ritual, very often people have encounters or experiences that are larger than the sum of the parts. You can delineate everything that happened, and still that doesn't account for the experience that you had because it's more than. But you've
Yes.
given lots of examples. Thank
Okay.
you.
Awesome. Um, I did one more thing to jump off of that. I do have I was invited to a blot atop one of these burial mounds by some of the speakers at this festival. Rune in particular, but also my colleague Matthias and some of the other performers. But it was, we were going around just making a toast to, and people had the option to toast who they wished, the gods or ancestors, but I incorporated the she or the hidden people in Gaelic culture into my little toast, and I used it as an opportunity to toast my grandparents because they I don't know, they passed over different points over the past decade, but I didn't give myself space to really mourn them. And I thought this would be appropriate to start, processing that because they passed when I was in the midst of my master's and PhD studies. And even in the intermediary point, I didn't give myself space to think about them or, process that whole thing. But I was able to in this ritual. And as soon as I did, because the concert was still going on at this point in the night. Like we were outside of the music area by the Great Hall and we were on the mounds. But as soon as I said my little piece, this beautiful rendition of a Vardruna song called Helvei, which I'll type in the chat because is uh this song, Einar Selvik has gone on record saying, I want people to listen to this to process grief because in the past we had songs for when someone was born, we would sing when we tilled the fields, we'd sing when we worked, we'd sing when we mourned, and we would sing to people as they were dying. And this song Helveien is his attempt at a modern recreation of that latter type of song. And as soon as I said my little piece, I forget the name of, I think her name is Aurora. That's her performance name. I don't know her real name. But she just from the festival, I heard this really haunting, beautiful rendition of it. I almost started to cry. And it was just, I feel like it was one of those little occurrences where it's like, well, something's happening here.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Diana has a question, and then why don't we make that our last one in the chat? Unless you want to ask in person, Diana.
Sorry, let me scroll back up. I did see, Diana, I did see you asked if my dissertation is available. Yes, it is. It should be published on, oh, what's the database? It's a giant database, but I'm happy to send it to you. I provided my email address in the chat. So please drop me a line. I'll send it to you directly.
Or if you have a link on that database, is it JSTOR or academia.edu?
It's not JSTOR, and honestly, I should remember what it is, but it's escaping me.
Because I'll put the link with
let me give you my contact.
Excellent.
And yeah, and Diana's asking about, is there an organic connection between metal and heathenry? Is there a history to that? Why isn't there a Celtic metal festival? Or maybe there is.
I think, you know what? There is oh, I saw that was Valerie. Yeah, okay, let me answer this, and Valerie, I will happy to get to yours.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Valerie.
I think metal, well, because Heilung and Vardruna, they have a metal background. They're metal adjacent, but they're technically folk. They're technically Nordic folk or dark ambient folk. There's a lot of labels. But I think with heavy metal, oh, awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Robert. And Angela. I think with heavy metal, because it's countercultural. And there also, there's a great scholar named Christopher Partridge who looks at re-emergent religions like Nordic Neopaganism, and he calls them occulture. I'll type that out. He calls them occulture. And he says they're a response to, like, he argues they're a response to, secularization and modernization and things like that. But, and I'm that we could talk for hours about that. But I think just as a genre, because there's folk metal too, there's a bunch of subgenres of metal. But I think folk metal in particular, it is tied to this. And I think people realize, and a lot of it, I mean, it's global. I mean, maybe some of you are familiar with the Hu or Tenger Cavalry. These are Mongolian folk bands. But I think people started to realize, like, hey, a lot of these really cool stories and a lot of these really cool instruments sound great with an electric guitar and blast beats. And it just popped off. And now some folk metal bands, there's some from the Baltic countries, they are the emphasis is placed way more on their traditional instruments. But, there's Celtic folk metal too. There's a band Eluvaiti from Switzerland. They're very good. And they produce, I mean, a couple of the ladies as part of that band, they can speak Gaulish. They can speak Gaelic. They sing in it. But there's also, there's Irish bands too. But there are these folk metal bands popping up all over Europe that are using it as a medium to share their culture and engage with it. But it's also happening here because in addition to folk metal, there's also black metal, which very, very countercultural and extreme. It started in Norway. There was a lot of murders. There's a lot of church burnings. But it's become co-opted by North American indigenous metal fans. There is an artist, or one of many, but there's an artist called Blackbraid. He is of the Iroquois nation. And his songs, his music is, now even though it's black metal, you could make the argument, well, that's a type of folk because he's singing about Iroquois mythology and spiritual figures and history. So I think it's, it's kind of that countercultural bent that heavy metal has, but it's weird because I think metal can be an adjective that doesn't just describe, electric guitars and, heavy drum beats and stuff. But I don't know, because some people in the metal community, they use metal to describe things that are authentic. Like, excuse me, like there's certain, folk, like Heilung of Vardruna, people will be like, oh, that's metal. Or folk from elsewhere too. I mean, I haven't written a paper on it. And I'm sure someone has at some point, that is a fellow metalhead, but I think metal as an adjective defining something authentic. I've absolutely heard people describe non-heavy metal music with that adjective, particularly folk-oriented music, whether it's Nordic, Celtic, Italic, Baltic, Finnic, Central Asian, what have you. So I don't know. I think, that was a very roundabout way of me saying, I think heavy metal is a genre. There is that countercultural bent, and neo-paganism is countercultural. It's a response. And it's all this stuff. I mean, it was stamped down, but it never went away. People were keeping it alive in rural areas, even in urban areas. Some people kept those traditions alive in the form of kitchen magic, for example. We are very obstinate creatures. If something works, especially ritual, you're not going to get rid of it. You're going to keep it in some way. Linda, thank you so much for posting that too. I am looking forward to reading that.
Okay.
I think that'd be a good article.
I hate to do this, but I think I have to call time.
Okay.
It sounds like we could sit around and do this the rest of the evening. Yeah, with something good to drink. Yeah, Linda, if you run across that Wild Hunt article, feel free to pass it on and I'll share it with everybody.
I put it in the chat, Holly.
You put the link in there?
I did.
Okay, great, thanks. Oh, I see. Yeah. All right. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. I know that some registered so they could watch the recording later, and I will get that up. And Patrick, we're so grateful. We really appreciate your sharing and so glad you've entered this field, which is so rich and diverse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being able to share a little bit of it, and I, look forward to hopefully seeing you all at some regional pagan gatherings once I stack some funds up, of course, and can travel.
And because it's my job, everybody remember it's annual appeal time. If you're so inclined, thank you for visiting cherryhill.seminary.org and making a contribution.
Thank you. This was awesome.
Thank
Awesome.
you.